He said I wasn't invited, keeping it small this year, so I kept it bigger. While my family gathered for their picture-perfect Christmas dinner, I was raising $2 million for charity at the resort they never knew I owned. Cameras flashed, celebrities smiled, and my father's business partners called me for a seat at the table. The next morning, their holiday photo had one caption: "She outshined us all. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from." Snow was falling hard that morning, the kind that made Denver look like it was trapped inside a snow globe. The light outside my apartment window was pale and cold, tinting everything blue and gray. I was on my third cup of coffee, and my fifth Zoom call of the day, pretending I wasn't exhausted. The Aurora Foundation team filled my screen. Faces from every time zone, all working through the holiday rush to finalize our end-of-year report. "Let's push the sponsorship announcement to next week," I said, scrolling through a spreadsheet. No one's thinking about sustainable housing 2 days before Christmas anyway. Someone laughed softly through the speaker. I smiled faintly, but didn't feel it. When the meeting ended, I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The snow outside was falling faster now, thick flakes clinging to the glass. For a moment, it felt peaceful. The quiet kind of silence that only comes when the whole world slows down. Then my phone buzzed. The name on the screen froze me. Dad. I stared at it for a few seconds, debating whether to answer. We hadn't spoken in months, but some reflex, the kind born from years of wanting to be seen, made me swipe right. "Hi, Dad." His voice was flat-clipped, as if we were two business associates calling to confirm a shipment. "This year, it'll just be your sister and her family. We're keeping it small." I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. "What?" "You heard me." He sighed impatiently, like the call was already a burden. "It's been a long year, and your sister's bringing the kids. We don't have the space, Lauren. You understand." The way he said it, like I was some distant cousin instead of his daughter, hit harder than it should have. I stared out the window, the world outside dissolving into white. I could almost see his office in my mind, the oak desk, the city skyline, his tie perfectly straight even on Christmas Eve. For a second I wanted to ask why. To remind him that he hadn't invited me last year either, or the year before that. To ask if Mom even knew he was calling. But I didn't. Instead, I took a slow breath and said, "Sure, I have a more important event tonight anyway." Silence. Not the kind that waits for you to fill it, but the kind that ends a conversation. I ended the call before he could say another word. The apartment felt smaller after that. I set the phone down, my hand trembling just enough to spill a line of coffee over the edge of my mug. It ran down my fingers, hot and sharp, but I didn't move. I just watched it drip onto the table, one dark drop after another, like a metronome marking time. I'd stopped expecting invitations a long time ago, but somehow, it still hurt. Maybe because every time he said, "just your sister," it sounded like he was saying, "not you." I stood, walked to the window, and pressed my palm against the cold glass. Below, the street was almost empty. A couple pulled their toddler through the snow, laughing as he tried to catch flakes on his tongue. Across the street, a woman in a red coat carried a stack of gifts into an apartment building. Somewhere, people were sitting down to family dinners. And me, I was standing in silence in a city that didn't even know my name. I turned away, grabbed my laptop, and flipped it open. The screen lit up with a familiar document, Aurora Foundation, Winter Gala Plan. I scrolled through the pages, past the guest lists, the design sketches, the lighting layouts. My fingers hovered over the word "canceled" in the subject line of an old email. Not this year. This time I wasn't going to wait for an invitation that would never come. I closed the old message and opened the new proposal I'd been drafting for weeks. The title glowed across the top of the page: Aurora Winter Charity Gala, Snow Haven Mountain Resort. The resort was mine, every acre of it. Built 2 years ago, tucked into the mountains west of Aspen. Most people didn't know I owned it. It wasn't about money or prestige. It was the place I'd built to remind myself that home could exist even when family didn't. I adjusted the lighting, plan clicked through photos of the ballroom. The long wooden tables I'd had carved by local artisans, the fireplace built from reclaimed stone. I imagined the space full of people. Strangers, friends, maybe a few who'd been forgotten by their own families too. A faint smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. If my father wanted to keep Christmas small, I'd make mine bigger. Not louder, not flashier, just warmer. For everyone who never got a seat at their family's table. The heater clicked off, leaving the apartment silent again. Outside, the snow kept falling, swirling in the wind, until the city blurred into a soft, endless gray. I whispered into the quiet, almost without meaning to. Let's see how bright the dark can get. Then I pulled the curtain aside. The reflection of the lamp caught my face in the window. Calm, tired, determined. The streetlights flickered on below, scattering gold across the snow. For a long time I just stood there watching the flakes drift down one after another until the whole world seemed to glow. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the hurt and the cold, something steady began to burn. The house always smelled like cinnamon and pine needles that time of year. But to me, it smelled like pretending. Our living room in Bloomington, Indiana glowed under cheap Christmas lights that flickered unevenly along the staircase. My sister Victoria sat in the center of it all. Perfect posture, perfect smile, her golden hair catching the firelight like she was part of the holiday decor. I sat at the edge of the sofa, clutching a small, unevenly wrapped box in my lap. Dad stood by the tree, handing out gifts, with the certainty of a judge delivering verdicts. "For you, sweetheart," he said, placing a box in Victoria's lap. She tore through the paper, gasping at the gold bracelet inside. "Real gold," he added, proud of himself. Then he turned to me, his tone cooling. "And for you, Lauren." He handed me a thin, rectangular box. Inside was a blank notebook, the kind you'd buy at a grocery store checkout. He smiled faintly, like it was wisdom disguised as a gift. "Write down what you want, kiddo. No one's going to know unless you say it." I remember tracing the edge of the notebook with my finger feeling the paper's roughness. "Thank you," I said softly. "Mom." Elaine gave me an apologetic look, the kind that begged me not to make it worse. I didn't. I just sat there quiet, as Dad raised his glass and said, "To family, to family." The words hung heavy like smoke that wouldn't clear. Later that night, I sat in my room, the Christmas lights downstairs, still glowing through the floorboards. I opened the notebook and wrote one line across the first page. "One day I'll leave this house and never need permission to exist." I pressed the pen so hard it tore the paper. The next day, life went on as usual. Victoria practiced her debate speech at the dining table while Dad read the paper and corrected her pronunciation. I worked on my science fair project in the garage, where it was cold enough for my breath to fog. When I won first place at the state level, the principal invited my parents to the ceremony. No one came. I held the medal on stage, smiling for photos with my teacher instead. When I got home that night, I placed the certificate in the center of the dining table next to Dad's folded newspaper. He didn't look up when he walked by. Mom said, "You should be proud, honey," and then went back to stirring her soup. I sat there staring at the bowl in front of me, thinking how strange it was that success could feel so much like failure. A few years later, I started filling that notebook. Dreams scribbled in the margins, ideas for inventions, letters. I'd never send. Most of it was about freedom. Not the kind they teach in civics class, but the quiet kind that means no one owns your choices. When the letter from Stanford arrived in 2010, I almost didn't open it. It felt too impossible. But when I saw the word congratulations, I dropped the envelope and laughed until I cried. At dinner, I placed the acceptance letter next to Dad's plate, where his newspaper usually sat. He read the first line and frowned. "Stanford in California." I nodded, smiling. "Full scholarship. I leave in August." He folded the letter, set it down carefully, and said, "Don't be ridiculous. You think we can afford to send you across the country? It's a scholarship, Dad. They're paying for it." He shook his head. "Already done with the conversation. You don't belong out there. You'll last a semester, maybe 2. The world's not kind to girls who think too much of themselves." I stared at him, trying to decide which hurt more. The words, or the certainty behind them. Mom kept her eyes on her plate. Victoria smirked just enough for me to notice. That night, I wrote one more line in the notebook. "Even if it kills me, I'm leaving." So I did. I spent the next few months working part-time at the library and tutoring classmates, saving every dollar I could. My guidance counselor helped me apply for a small travel grant. When the check arrived, it was enough for a one-way ticket to California. I packed my clothes into a single suitcase, taped the notebook to the inside lining, and left before sunrise. The sky was the color of steel, and frost clung to every window of the house. Dad was standing on the porch arms, crossed, his breath fogging in the air. "You really think you're smarter than everyone else?" I stopped at the bottom of the steps, my suitcase handle cold in my palm. "No," I said. "I just think I'm allowed to try." He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Don't come back if you fail." I nodded once. "I won't need to." As I walked to the cab, my shoes crunched over the ice. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I might stay. At the airport, I sat by the window, watching the snow pile against the runway lights. The plane engines roared in the distance, but all I heard was his voice replaying that one sentence over and over. "Don't come back if you fail," I whispered into the noise. "Then I'll never fail." When the plane lifted off, I looked down at the frozen fields shrinking beneath me. Indiana faded into a blur of white and gray. And for the first time in my life, the world felt wide open. I pressed my forehead to the window, the cold biting against my skin, and thought, this is what it means to start over. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless, covering everything I was leaving behind. The air at Stanford smelled like eucalyptus and ambition. Everything shimmered under the California sun. The sandstone walls, the rows of palm trees lining Palm Drive, even the students with their bright futures and bright smiles. I used to walk through the courtyard with my head down, a backpack heavy enough to leave marks on my shoulders, pretending I belonged there as much as they did. During the day, I was just another engineering student buried in formulas and lab reports. At night, I shelved books at the campus library, or poured coffee at a tiny shop 2 blocks from the quad. The caffeine paid my rent. The silence paid my sanity. No one asked where I came from, and I didn't offer. It was the first time in my life that being invisible felt like freedom. But even freedom is exhausting when you have to earn it hour by hour. I'd get home past midnight to my small dorm room that always smelled like instant noodles and printer ink, drop my bag, and stare at the ceiling fan spinning above me. Sometimes I'd whisper to myself, "You're doing fine, Lauren. You made it." Saying it out loud made it real. The real turning point came one spring afternoon in 2011. I was in the engineering lab with 2 classmates, Nina and Eric, working on our senior project, a water quality monitoring system for rural communities. Eric handled the coding. Nina ran the data analytics, and I designed the sensor architecture. We spent nights sleeping on the lab floor, surviving on vending machine snacks and cheap coffee. When the project finally worked, the sensors transmitted data from a contaminated creek near Santa Clara. It felt like watching hope blink alive on a screen. We presented it at a sustainability conference, and a small environmental startup offered us funding. That night, the 3 of us sat on the steps outside the lab eating takeout burritos. Eric said, "We could turn this into something big, sell the tech, get real investors." I nodded, but the word sell echoed in my chest like something fragile cracking. "What if we used it for something that actually mattered?" I asked. Nina smiled. "It does matter. People need clean water. I mean, beyond the tech," I said. "What if we built a foundation, something that helps kids like us get here too?" Eric laughed, not unkindly. "You sound like a philanthropist." "Maybe I am," I said, and I meant it. A few weeks later, when we received a formal funding offer, I told them I wanted to sell my shares. They stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Nina asked, "Are you sure you could be rich in 5 years? Money's not the point." I said, "Freedom is." I used every cent from that sale to start what would become the Aurora Foundation, a nonprofit focused on environmental education and scholarships for young women in science. The night before I signed the transfer papers, I sat on my dorm bed and stared at my phone. My thumb hovered over the call button for a long time before I finally hit it. Dad answered on the 3rd ring. "Lauren." His voice was dry, surprised. "Everything okay?" "I just wanted to tell you something," I said, trying to steady my voice. "The project I worked on, it's being funded. I'm selling my shares to start a nonprofit. It's called the Aurora Foundation." There was a pause. I could almost hear the creak of his leather chair back in Indiana. Then came that laugh, the one that never reached his eyes. "A charity, Lauren. People who have money do charity. People who don't have money work for those who do. It's not about money. It's always about money," he said flatly. "You're wasting your education. All that work just to play social worker." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced my words to come out calm. "It's not for you to understand, Dad. It's so..." I never become someone like you. Silence. Then a sharp click as he hung up. I sat there in the dark, the phone still warm in my hand. For a few seconds I felt the familiar ache, the urge to explain myself to make him proud. But then, for the first time, I didn't. The only approval I needed was my own. The next morning I signed the papers and mailed them off. I withdrew from the noise of campus life, focusing on Aurora. My professors said I was idealistic. My friends said I was brave. Maybe I was just tired of fighting for permission to dream. After graduation, I packed 2 suitcases and moved to Denver. The city felt open and grounded, less glamorous than California, but more real. I rented a tiny apartment above a bakery that smelled like sugar and smoke, set up a desk by the window, and started drafting the structure for my foundation. The work was slow. Grants were hard to get. I spent nights filling out proposals and days calling schools to find young women interested in STEM. For every yes, I got 10 no's, but each yes mattered. I used to joke that Aurora was built on coffee and stubbornness, but beneath that joke was truth. It was built on the kind of resilience that grows out of rejection. Months passed. One night, I looked up from my cluttered desk and saw the mountains in the distance, their peaks capped with snow glinting under the moonlight. They reminded me of Indiana winters. But this time, the cold didn't sting. It felt like clarity. I started sketching in my notebook, the same one Dad gave me all those years ago. The cover was worn pages frayed at the edges. I drew a cabin, then a hall, then an open courtyard surrounded by pine trees. Underneath, I wrote Snow Haven, a place where everyone is welcome. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a blueprint. The next morning, I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the Rockies. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I was building something new. By the winter of 2023, Snow Haven finally stood the way I had pictured it on paper years before. A cedar and stone resort nestled between rows of pines, their branches heavy with snow. From the main terrace, you could see the lake frozen solid, glittering like glass under the thin afternoon sun. When the wind blew, it carried the scent of pine sap and wood smoke, and the sound of hammering from the last wing, still under renovation, echoed through the valley. I walked alongside the engineering team, clipboard in hand, the breath of each person forming tiny clouds in the cold. Every room needs smart energy regulators installed before the grand opening. I reminded them, we're not here to waste power or resources. If it doesn't run clean, it doesn't run at all. A younger electrician named Cody nodded, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. You've got it, Ms. Hayes. Honestly, I've never worked anywhere like this. He wasn't the first to say that. The staff came from places most employers never looked twice at. Single mothers, veterans, students trying to pay for community college. I'd chosen them deliberately, not out of charity, but because they understood what it meant to be overlooked. As we walked through the main lodge, one of the housekeepers, Maria, paused beside the fireplace she'd helped lay stone for. She wiped her hands on her apron and said softly, "It feels alive in here, like the walls are breathing." I smiled. That's the idea. This place belongs to people who were never picked first. Her eyes watered, and she nodded before getting back to work. By the time the last inspection ended, the light was beginning to fade. The sky over Aspen turned lavender, then silver. I stepped outside, tightening my coat as I watched the lights flicker on one by one along the roofline. Snow Haven glowed against the dark like something out of a dream I didn't realize I'd been chasing for years. The sound of tires crunching through snow made me turn. A sleek black SUV stopped by the entrance. The door opened, and out stepped Eleanor Pierce. Even bundled in fur and wool, she carried herself like someone who'd long ago learned that grace was its own armor. "Still can't believe you built this," she said, her voice warm, amused. "A place this big, this peaceful? It's a statement, Lauren." I laughed, walking to meet her. I just wanted somewhere people could breathe, somewhere they didn't have to earn a seat at the table. Eleanor glanced up at the massive beams above the porch, then back at me. "You built something I call proof. Proof that pain can be turned into architecture." Her words settled somewhere deep. We stood there for a moment, the wind sweeping across the snow, carrying a kind of silence that felt sacred. Later in my office, the fire burned low in the stone hearth. I'd placed a small vase of wildflowers on the desk, a gift from one of the cleaning staff. The petals were slightly wilted, but they added color to the wooden room. It was enough. Sophie, my assistant, pushed through the door without knocking. Her red scarf half undone, snow in her hair. "Lauren, you need to see this." She held out a folded magazine. "What is it?" She hesitated before handing it over. "It's from the Aspen Chronicle. They published a piece about the foundation." The headline sat heavy at the top of the page, Aurora Foundation. Genuine philanthropy or strategic PR? I skimmed the paragraphs. Anonymous sources' speculation about my motives. A tone dripping with polite skepticism. The article ended with, "Perhaps Ms. Hayes is just another wealthy idealist using generosity as a brand." Sophie's face flushed. "Do you want me to contact them?" "We could issue a response, clarify the mission." I set the magazine down and shook my head. "No, let it go. But they're questioning your integrity." "They're allowed to," I said. "We'll answer with the work, not words." Sophie looked unconvinced but nodded. "You're calmer than I'd be. Anger wastes energy." I said simply, though inside a small flicker of hurt burned low. It wasn't anger, really. It was recognition. I'd been underestimated all my life. It was almost comforting to see it in print. After Sophie left, I picked up the magazine again, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer beside my notebook, the same one my father had given me. For a second, I wondered if he'd seen the article too, and if he'd smirked the same way he did when I told him about the foundation. Outside, snow had started falling again, soft and slow. The window pane fogged slightly with the change in temperature. I grabbed my coat and stepped out onto the balcony. The world below was quiet, blanketed in white. Footsteps sounded behind me, careful and unhurried. Eleanor appeared at the doorway holding 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me, steam rising between us. "You saw the article," she said. It wasn't a question. I did. And I took a sip, the heat spreading through my chest. I'm not surprised. They always need a story. A woman builds something this size. Suddenly it must be about ego. Eleanor leaned against the railing, her breath visible in the cold. People confuse humility with silence, and silence with weakness. I looked out at the lake, the reflection of the lodge shimmering faintly in the frozen surface. Sometimes silence is the only language that makes sense. She smiled. Exactly. The quiet kind of revenge. We stood there together, the snow swirling around us. No sound except the distant hum of the wind through the trees. I watched the flakes land on the railing, melt, and vanish. There was a strange peace in that moment, a stillness that felt earned. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to prove I deserved to exist in someone else's world, and how finally I'd built my own. Eleanor set her empty mug down and straightened her scarf. "Get some rest, Lauren. You have more to do than most, and you've already done enough for one lifetime." I nodded, watching as she disappeared back inside. When the door closed behind her, I leaned on the railing, eyes lifted toward the sky. The clouds had cleared, revealing a scatter of sharp white stars. The cold bit at my cheeks, but I didn't move. Somewhere behind me, the fireplace cracked softly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the heat and the cold balance perfectly. Eleanor was right. Sometimes the best answer isn't a statement or a headline. Sometimes it's simply standing still, while the world learns to listen. The walls of my Denver office were lined with photographs. Young women in graduation gowns, teachers in rural schools holding laptops we'd donated. Students standing beside solar panels they'd helped build. Every picture was a quiet victory, a reminder that Aurora Foundation was more than an idea now. It was a heartbeat. I was signing off on a new batch of scholarships when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Victoria. For a second I considered letting it ring, but curiosity won. I picked up. "Hey," I said cautiously. Her voice came through crisp, polished, the same tone she used in courtrooms and charity luncheons. "Lauren, I'm calling because Dad's not doing well. His blood pressure's been up again, and the stress from the press isn't helping." I kept my pen poised over the paper. "I'm sorry to hear that." She hesitated. "He just needs peace right now. Maybe don't do anything that might upset him further." The words landed with that familiar mix of condescension and control. I almost laughed. "You mean don't exist in public? Don't remind him? I'm still his daughter." "Don't twist my words," she said quickly. "You know how he is. He cares about the family's reputation. The press has already been watching since that article about Aurora." I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the Denver skyline, glowing under a gray sky. "He's disappointed in me, Victoria. not because I did something wrong, but because I stopped bowing to him. There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breathing through the receiver. You don't understand. Dad built everything we have from nothing. He's proud. He's just trying to protect the name. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. And what exactly does he protect it with silence exclusion? Maybe he should try honesty. Her voice softened, almost pleading. Lore, please, don't make this harder than it has to be. I looked up at the photo above my desk, a group shot from Aurora's first graduating class. Harder, I repeated quietly. Victoria, my whole life was the hard part. This is the easy part, she exhaled sharply. You've changed. No, I said I just stopped apologizing. There was nothing left to say. She muttered something about calling me next week, then hung up. The silence after her voice disappeared was strange, neither peaceful nor heavy, just empty. I stared at the paperwork in front of me, but couldn't read another line. My eyes drifted to the old framed photo on the shelf, a Christmas family portrait from years ago. Victoria in the center, radiant as always. My parents on either side, smiling for the camera. I was barely in the frame, standing off to the right, a half-shadowed afterthought. I got up, crossed the room, and picked up the frame. The glass had a faint crack down the middle, slicing through my father's reflection. I set it back down gently. The email alert pinged on my laptop. From Hayes Development Group. Subject brand representation. I opened it, scanning the short message. Dear Ms. Hayes, please refrain from using the Hayes name in connection with any public events or marketing for Aurora Foundation. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining professional boundaries. Regards, H.G. Communications Department, Professional Boundaries. I read it twice, then let out a small laugh. Quiet and bitter. The company my father had spent his life building was now sending corporate memos to disown me. Sophie knocked and poked her head through the door. Everything okay? Perfect, I said, closing the laptop. Apparently, I'm officially uninvited from my own last name. She frowned. What does that even mean? It means they're scared I might make the family look human. She didn't know how to respond. Do you want me to draft a response? No, I said. Let it sit. After she left, I opened my notes for the upcoming Aurora Gala. The event outline was mostly logistics. Guest lists, donation pledges, floor layouts. But at the top, there was still a blank space reserved for my opening remarks. I stared at the cursor blinking, waiting. Then, almost without thinking, I typed a single line. This table is for those who were once left out. I leaned back, reading it over. The words looked simple, but I could feel the weight behind them. Every year I'd spent outside the circle, every cold dinner where my chair was missing every conversation that started with your sister instead of my name, it all condensed into that one sentence. As the day stretched into evening, the light in my office shifted to gold. I signed the last stack of documents, placed them neatly into a folder, and shut the lid on my laptop. The hum of the city below drifted up through the glass. I stood for a moment, letting the warmth of the sunset spill across the room. The photographs on the wall glowed faintly, each one alive with color and hope. I thought of my students, of Maria and Cody at Snowhaven, of Eleanor's quiet strength. My family might have erased me from their story, but I had already written my own. I turned off the desk lamp. The office dimmed to a soft amber. In the reflection of the window, I saw myself clearly, no longer a shadow at the edge of someone else's picture. Just me. And in that stillness, I realized I didn't need their permission to exist anymore. I exhaled slowly, almost smiling. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace. The week before Christmas, Snowhaven looked like something pulled straight from a storybook. The lodge glowed beneath the mountain sky, strings of warm lights wrapping around every beam and window. A 20-foot pine tree stood in the main hall, branches heavy with glass ornaments that caught the firelight and scattered it across the cedar walls. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine resin, and beneath it all was the faint hum of quiet anticipation, like the whole place was holding its breath. Sophie was crouched near the front desk, arranging small gold place cards inside polished holders. Governor Reynolds, Ethan Brooks. Natalie Frost, she murmured, reading off names as she worked. I leaned over her shoulder. Make sure we seat the governor beside the education sponsors. I want him to hear what those women from Chicago are doing with the STEM scholarships. Sophie grinned. You're mixing politicians, actors, and billionaires at one table? That's either genius or chaos. Maybe both, I said. But it'll make them listen. She nodded, then froze. Oh my God, is that who I think it is? I turned to see James Porter stepping through the glass doors, brushing snow from his coat. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and looked like someone who belonged in a courtroom, not in a mountain lodge surrounded by tinsel and wreaths. James, I called. You're early. He gave me a half smile. You're impossible to schedule, so I came to you. He placed the portfolio on the counter and opened it. Final permits, insurance confirmations, and he hesitated, tapping one page. The guest list. You're sure you want this public, yes? I said without hesitation. He looked at me for a long moment. You know what it means if your father sees it. He will. I said. And I'm counting on that. He sighed, sliding the papers back into his folder. You're the only client I've ever had who uses courage as a legal strategy. I don't call it courage, I said, smiling faintly. I call it clarity. He gave a small nod, then left me to the sound of Christmas music echoing faintly from the lounge. By late afternoon, the snow was falling in thick, slow flakes. I stood by the front window, watching the wind swirl it into silver waves. Everything outside looked untouched perfect. Inside, the noise of preparation filled the air. Plates, clinking laughter from the kitchen. The soft rustle of garlands being hung along the balcony railing. I almost didn't hear the notification from my phone. The message came from an anonymous email address. If you go through with this, you'll regret it. Some things should stay buried. My stomach tightened for a moment, then eased. I'd been threatened before. Subtly, indirectly. But this felt different. There was something personal in it, a hint of desperation. Sophie appeared beside me, reading over my shoulder before I could lock the screen. Who sent that no-name? I said, slipping the phone into my pocket. She looked alarmed. Lauren, this isn't just rude. It's dangerous. Should I tell James? I shook my head. No, people don't threaten what they don't fear. Fear isn't a good sign, she whispered. Sometimes it's the best one, I said quietly. It means you're close to the truth. She didn't understand, not completely, but she nodded anyway. The hours passed quickly. As night settled in, the snow outside deepened until it was waist-high along the driveway. The lodge glowed brighter against the darkness. I walked through the ballroom, checking the final setup. Long walnut tables lined with candles, silver place settings, and evergreen runners that filled the air with a forest scent. The entire space shimmered in gold light. From the second-floor balcony, I could see the entire room. For a moment, I just stood there taking it in. Every chair, every plate, every small detail had been planned with purpose. There were no kids' tables here, no back corners for the forgotten. Just one long, continuous table. Footsteps approached behind me. Eleanor Pierce appeared, bundled in a charcoal wool coat, her silver hair catching the light like frost. In her hands, she carried a long garment bag. I brought something, she said, her voice soft and amused. It's been in my closet since 1978. She unzipped the bag, revealing a floor-length gown of silver blue satin, simple and striking. I wore this the night I received my first industry award, she said. I thought maybe it was time it belonged to someone else. I reached out to touch the fabric. It was cool and smooth, like running my hand across moonlight. Eleanor. I can't accept this, she smiled. You can, because tomorrow night you won't be anyone's shadow. I swallowed hard. Thank you. Try it on, she said, waving a hand. The mirror in the East Suite has better lighting. I did. The gown fit as if it had been waiting for me all these years. When I stood before the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. The straight shoulders, the calm expression, the quiet power in her eyes. I thought of that 14-year-old girl in Indiana, clutching a notebook, while her father handed her a lesson disguised as a gift. I thought of all the Christmases since then, spent pretending I didn't care. Now I did care, but differently. I stepped out of the room to show Eleanor. Her eyes softened when she saw me. Beautiful, she said simply. Not the dress, the presence. I laughed under my breath. I still don't know what tomorrow will bring. She reached for my hand. Then you're exactly where you're meant to be. Later that night, the wind picked up, carrying snow across the windows like ribbons of white silk. The world outside was nearly silent, except for the low hum of the storm. I stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders. The cold stung my face sharp and clean. From here, I could see the valley stretching below the pines bending under the weight of snow. The lights of the resort shimmered like embers against the dark. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. Tomorrow they would all come. The investors, the politicians, the journalists, the very people who once looked through me like glass. And they'd see me standing where I belonged, not because I'd been invited, but because I'd built the place myself. The wind pressed against me, biting and relentless. I whispered into it, tomorrow they'll see me, not because I want them to, because they won't be able to look away. The snow kept falling thick and endless, swallowing the sound of everything else. Snow fell in slow, heavy curtains that night, soft enough to muffle the sound of tires crunching up the long drive to Snowhaven Mountain Resort. Headlights stretched in a golden line through the trees, each car carrying a name, a title, a story that once existed far beyond mine. The valet team rushed to open doors, their breaths visible in the frozen air. Inside, the lobby glowed warm with candlelight and jazz, the kind of music that filled the quiet between words. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, the silk blue gown Eleanor had given me catching the light like frost under a full moon. My hair was pinned neatly, my hands steady, despite the pulse I could feel in my throat. Eleanor stood beside me, her eyes soft but sharp. "Breathe," she murmured. "You don't need to say much tonight. Just smile. The light will find you." I nodded, and for the first time in years I felt calm. Not the fragile kind that could break with one word, but the steady kind that comes when you finally stop running from yourself. The ballroom below shimmered with movement. Waiters passed trays of champagne, the band's trumpet player hit a low, sultry note, and laughter swelled like a tide. The room smelled faintly of cedar citrus and anticipation. "Ms. Hayes," a voice called. I turned to see Governor Linda Carter approaching with her husband. "This place is extraordinary. You've outdone every foundation gala in the state." I smiled. "That's kind of you, Governor. We just wanted to make people feel welcome." Behind her, Ethan Brooks, one of our major investors, offered his hand. "Lauren, this is breathtaking. You're changing the way philanthropy feels." Maybe I said lightly. "Or maybe we're just reminding people what generosity looks like when it's not transactional." He chuckled. "I'll drink to that." Camera flashes began to strobe from the far corner of the room. A few reporters had been invited, just enough to cover the story, not enough to make it feel performative. They asked for quotes, their voices blending into a familiar rhythm. "Ms. Hayes." "What inspired Snowhaven hope?" I said simply, "and the belief that kindness doesn't need a price tag." As I spoke, I could see the reflection of my own image flashing across their camera screens. For once, it didn't make me shrink. Across the city in a home I hadn't stepped foot in for over a decade, my father was probably sitting in his leather chair flipping through channels pretending not to care. But I knew he'd stop when he saw my face on the financial news broadcast. He always watched the business segment. And sure enough, halfway across Denver, Richard Hayes froze in front of his television as my voice carried through the speakers. I was standing on the ballroom stage, the microphone catching my breath, as I said, "This table was built for those who were once left out. For the ones who waited for permission to belong. You don't need an invitation to be part of something good. You just need courage." Applause began softly, then rose into a wave that filled every corner of the hall. I could feel the vibration of it in my chest, steady and alive. For a moment, I thought of him sitting there. Ty loosened the television flickering blue light across his face, watching the daughter he'd written off become someone he couldn't ignore. Somewhere, a journalist was already typing. Rachel Foster, the reporter who had followed Aurora's progress for years, posted her story online before dessert was even served. The headline hit like an echo through the digital world. From the daughter uninvited to Christmas to the woman who owns a $120 million mountain resort. I didn't know about the article until hours later, but by then the reaction was already rippling across social media. Guests at the gala began checking their phones, murmuring to each other. One of the photographers turned his camera toward me, smiling knowingly. Sophie whispered at my shoulder, "You're trending, Lauren. It's everywhere." I laughed under my breath. Let it. Some stories are meant to be told loud. From the stage, I looked out over the room. There were faces I'd only ever seen in magazines, people who had built empires, people who had inherited them, and people who had clawed their way to be here tonight. But in that moment, all of them were simply human. Hands clapping eyes, bright hearts softened by something they didn't expect to feel. Outside, the snow thickened, pressing against the tall windows until the world looked blurred and infinite. The light from the chandeliers reflected off the glass, creating the illusion of hundreds of tiny suns suspended in the night. When the band shifted to a slower tune, Eleanor appeared beside me again. She handed me a flute of champagne, her old eyes sparkling. "To your silence," she said. "It's the loudest thing in the room." I smiled, clinking my glass gently against hers. To the years it took to find it. We stood there for a while, not talking, just watching the guests laugh and dance beneath the golden lights. Across the hall, a young woman who had once received an Aurora scholarship raised her glass to me from her table. I raised mine back. She mouthed the words, "Thank you." It was such a small thing, but it hit me harder than the applause, harder than the headlines. Somewhere deep down I knew my father had seen it too. That he was watching, not just me, but everything I had built without him. And realizing it would outlive both of us. Eleanor leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "Just for me, you've already won Lauren. You stopped needing their approval." I looked out at the sea of people, the flicker of candles and laughter dancing together, and felt something in me finally exhale. "Maybe that's the only kind of victory that lasts," I said. The band played on. The snow outside fell harder, sealing the world in white. And for the first time in my life, the silence inside me didn't ache. It sang. Christmas morning arrived cold and sharp, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and refused to leave. The streets of downtown Denver were still quiet, blanketed in snow. But inside my father's office, the air was anything but still. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine it perfectly. The leather chairs, the mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the frozen skyline. The television flickered across the room, painting everything in a pale blue light. On the screen, a news anchor's voice rang bright and polished. "The Aurora Gala drew leaders from across the country last night, business icons, political figures, artists, and philanthropists. A celebration of compassion and innovation hosted by Lauren Hayes, founder of the Aurora Foundation and owner of Snow Haven Mountain Resort." They cut to footage of the ballroom, my ballroom, candles glowing, laughter rising, and me standing at the podium in that silver-blue gown saying, "This table was built for those who were once left out." I could almost hear the sound of the glass shattering when my father threw the remote at the TV. "She's using my money," he shouted, "to humiliate this family." Michael Trent, his communications director, flinched from across the desk. "Sir, if you'll let me explain." "Explain what?" Richard's voice thundered through the office. "That my daughter has turned into a spectacle, that the name Hayes is now plastered across every headline next to hers." Michael hesitated, his hands clutching a folder. "It's not just that, sir. There's something else." He slid a printed memo across the desk. "There's talk of a federal audit. The Financial Ethics Committee wants to review the company's charitable transactions. They're requesting files from 2019 to present." Richard froze, the lines on his forehead deepening. "Who started this?" "We're not certain," Michael said carefully. "But it appears the request originated from a journalist's inquiry. Rachel Foster, I believe. She published the piece about the gala last night." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Richard's jaw tightened. "Rachel Foster." He repeated slowly. "That woman worked for us 5 years ago. I fired her for leaking internal reports." Michael shifted uneasily. "Yes, sir. It appears she's, well, still interested in the company's affairs." The office fell silent, except for the faint hum of the TV still playing in the background. The reporter's voice sounded distant now, almost mocking. "Ms. Hayes's speech emphasized transparency, empathy, and a belief that integrity, not wealth, defines legacy. Legacy. The word made Richard's temples pulse. He snatched the folder from the desk and flipped through it, scanning the lines of numbers, donation records, and transactions, some clean, some less so. His reflection glared back at him from the glossy surface of the report, distorted and tired. "Do you know what this means, Michael?" he said finally. "It means they're going to ask questions." "No," Richard snapped. "It means someone's digging, and they won't stop until they bury me." Michael swallowed hard. "Should we prepare a statement?" Richard didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the muted TV screen, where a photo of me filled the frame. I was smiling, surrounded by light. Below my image, a caption scrolled across the bottom. "Lauren Hayes, the woman redefining philanthropy. a reminder that kindness is the only currency that never loses value. He stared at it until the words blurred. I imagine he felt it then, the first crack in the armor he'd spent his entire life polishing. For as long as I could remember, my father had measured worth in power, respect, and fear. To him, love was weakness, generosity, a marketing tactic, and forgiveness. Something for people who couldn't win. He'd built his empire on control, every brick laid with certainty, and now his daughter's quiet defiance had shaken the foundation. Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced down, his face paling. "Sir, the committee's email just arrived." Richard gestured impatiently. "Read it." Michael cleared his throat. "From the Office of Federal Financial Oversight. Subject, request for immediate disclosure. It says, please provide full records of all donations, contributions, and third-party transfers linked to the Hayes Development Foundation. Deadline, December 28, 2025. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard sank back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. Outside the windows, snow fell in slow, relentless sheets, covering the city in white silence. Inside, he felt the weight of everything he had kept buried for years, rising to the surface. He ran a hand over his face, his voice low, almost to himself. "She thinks she's better than me." Michael said nothing. "She's not." Richard went on. "She's my daughter. Everything she has came from me." But even as he said it, his gaze flicked back to the television, to the image of me standing on stage with my hands open, not grasping, not demanding, just open. The applause behind me had swelled genuine and warm, a sound he'd never earned, no matter how many millions he'd made. The broadcast ended the screen, fading to black. For a moment he could see his own reflection there, older than he remembered, smaller too. He stood pacing to the window. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips. The city stretched below him, glittering faintly through the snow. He thought of all the meetings, the deals, the people he'd stepped over to build his name. None of it felt solid anymore. On the corner of his desk, a magazine lay open. Forbes, the December issue. My face was on the cover, the same photo the networks had used. The headline read, "Lauren Hayes, the Business of Compassion." Beneath it, in smaller print, kindness is the only asset that never depreciates. He stared at it for a long time, then closed the magazine, slowly pressing his hand over the cover as if to smother the words. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel angry. Not really. What crept in instead was something colder, sharper. Fear. Not fear of losing his company or his fortune, but fear of being irrelevant, of realizing that the daughter he'd dismissed had surpassed him in every way that mattered. He sank back into his chair, elbows on the desk, and pressed his fingers to his forehead. Outside, the snow kept falling. The lights of the city flickered faintly against the storm, distant and small. And in that quiet, for the first time, Richard Hayes understood what it meant to lose. Not to failure, not to competition, but to grace. The press conference room was packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with camera flashes and whispered speculation. Reporters filled every aisle, their microphones held out like weapons, their voices rising over one another in the scramble for a quote. Behind the curtain, I took a slow breath and adjusted the cuffs of my blazer. James Porter stood beside me, reading over the brief statement one last time. "You don't have to do this," he murmured. "Let the PR team handle it. You're not responsible for your father's mess." "I know," I said, "but silence isn't the same as absence." When I stepped onto the stage, the noise dropped to a low hum. The bright white lights made it hard to see their faces, but I could feel their eyes measuring waiting. I stood behind the podium, hands steady. "Aurora Foundation. I began is and always has been an independent organization. We have no financial or administrative ties to Hayes Development Group. Our records are transparent, and we welcome any review." Dozens of cameras clicked in rhythm. A woman in the second row called out, "Ms. Hayes, do you have a comment on the federal investigation into your father's company?" I met her gaze. "I don't comment on things I'm not a part of." Another voice rose. "Do you think your success helped expose his misconduct?" I smiled faintly. Aurora's purpose isn't to expose anyone. It's to illuminate what's right. Before they could throw more questions, I stepped back from the microphone. "That's all for today." Voices exploded behind me as I left the stage, but I didn't turn back. The door closed, muffling the chaos. James followed his tie, slightly loosened frustration lining his face. Lauren, walking away like that makes you look evasive. You should get ahead of this before they twist the story. I paused, facing him. You can't fight smoke with more smoke, James. The truth will hold. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You really believe that, don't you? I have to, I said softly. It's the only reason I can sleep at night. By the next morning, the headlines had already spread like wildfire. Hayes Group accused of misusing charity funds. Federal inquiry. Expands to corporate donations, from father to founder. The Hayes family divide. The media didn't care about the nuance. They wanted contrast. His fall made my rise more dramatic. I was the light to his shadow, the daughter who became a symbol of everything he wasn't. And somehow that narrative had taken on a life of its own. At the Aurora office, Sophie sat by the reception desk, scrolling through the newsfeed, her brow furrowed. It's everywhere, she said quietly. CNN, the Journal, even Forbes followed up. They're calling it the Hayes redemption arc. I gave a small, humorless laugh. Redemption isn't a headline. It's a lifetime. A few hours later, James walked into my office, carrying a thick envelope. His expression was unreadable. He placed it on my desk. From Hayes Development Group's attorneys, he said. It's a formal complaint accusing Aurora Foundation of defamation. I stared at it for a moment, the company letterhead familiar and distant all at once. So that's how he's fighting back, I murmured. James crossed his arms. He's trying to scare you. It won't hold in court, but we should respond carefully. I opened the envelope, scanned the first few lines, and folded it shut. No, we're not responding at all. He blinked. You're serious? I nodded. You don't fight in the mud with someone who built their house there. He hesitated. That's poetic, but risky. Maybe I said, but dignity isn't strategy. It's the point. By evening, the story had grown even larger. News anchors discussed my father's reputation in measured tones, while analysts speculated on what the investigation might uncover. I didn't watch any of it until late that night, when one headline caught my eye. Federal court announces formal investigation into Hayes Development Group. The television showed footage of my father stepping out of a black car surrounded by reporters and flashing bulbs. His face was tight jaw, clenched eyes sunken. He looked smaller than I remembered. Mr. Hayes. Any comment on the charges, someone shouted. He ignored them, pushing through the crowd. The anchor's voice filled the room. If found guilty of falsifying charitable reports, Mr. Hayes could face severe financial penalties and possible criminal prosecution. Representatives for the company declined to comment. I muted the TV. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the frozen image of him walking toward the courthouse. There was no satisfaction in it, no vindication, only the quiet ache of what could have been different. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She had that knowing look, the one that saw straight through any performance. I thought you'd be watching, she said gently. I wasn't going to, I admitted. But it's everywhere. She joined me by the window, looking out at the night. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting through the light from the porch. You don't look happy, she said. I'm not, I said. He's still my father. She nodded. And yet, this was never your doing. I know. I paused. It just feels strange seeing the world call it justice, when all I see is loss. Eleanor placed a hand on my shoulder. Justice doesn't always come with joy. Sometimes it just arrives quietly when no one's cheering, and you realize it was never your job to push it along. Time did it for you. Her words settled in my chest like warm embers. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the drive, the trees, the rooftops of the guest lodges. Down below, a few staff members were still cleaning up from the gala-gathering tablecloths and blowing out the last of the candles. The air was calm, hushed. From my balcony, I watched as the final flame flickered, then went out. The scent of smoke and pine lingered in the cold air. For the first time in years, there was no need to prove anything. The world was finally catching up to the truth I'd known all along, and all I could do was stand there silent while the snow erased the last traces of last night's celebration. The last week of December brought a stillness to the mountains, the kind that makes sound feel smaller. Snowhaven was quiet that afternoon, the sky the color of faded silver, the wind carrying a cold so pure it burned the lungs. I was in the conference room with James and Eleanor reviewing next quarter's scholarship projections when Sophie burst through the door, her face pale and uncertain. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "She says she's your sister." For a second I thought I'd misheard her. "Victoria." Sophie nodded. "She's in the lobby." James exchanged a look with Eleanor, then stood. "Do you want me to stay?" "No," I said, my pulse quickening. "This is something I need to handle myself." When I stepped into the lobby, the warmth from the fireplace collided with the cold she'd brought in. Victoria stood near the entrance, wrapped in an elegant wool coat dusted with snow, her hair pulled into a perfect knot that couldn't hide how tired she looked. "Lauren," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Victoria." I replied, the name unfamiliar in my mouth after so many years. She gave a small, unsure smile. "You've done well for yourself. This place is breathtaking." "Why are you here?" I asked quietly. She hesitated before setting her purse on the table. "Because I couldn't pretend anymore." I didn't speak. She looked around the lodge, taking in the photographs on the walls, the staff passing through with clipboards and laughter. "You were right," she said finally. "Dad can't control everything forever. The investigation, his lawyers, he's unraveling. You have no idea how bad it's gotten." I crossed my arms. "Maybe I do." She looked at me with pleading eyes. "I'm not here to defend him. I'm here because I can't keep defending myself for staying silent." The words hit like a wind shift, sharp, necessary. James appeared in the hallway, hesitated, and then quietly stepped back. Eleanor lingered behind him, watching from a distance like she knew what this moment meant. I took a step closer. "You stayed by his side when it suited you, when he praised you, when you had everything I didn't." Her eyes filled with tears. "You think that was happiness? You think living in his shadow was a prize? You didn't have to live in it," I said. "You became it." She shook her head, wiping at her cheek. "You don't know how scared I was, of losing everything, of becoming the next you, cut off, forgotten. I told myself I was protecting the family, but I was protecting my fear. I looked away, the anger I'd carried for years pressing against my ribs. Silence is still a choice, Victoria, and it's still a weapon." The fire popped in the hearth, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "I know," she whispered, "and I hate that it took me this long to see it." I walked to the bar cart in the corner and poured 2 glasses of red wine. When I turned back, her shoulders were trembling. I handed her a glass. "If you really want to change," I said, "stop hiding behind him. Quit the company. Tell the truth about what you know." Her fingers tightened around the glass. "You don't understand what that would mean." "Yes, I do," I said. "It means freedom." She stared at the wine, then looked up at me. "You're stronger than I thought." "No," I said quietly. "I just ran out of excuses sooner." Eleanor stepped forward, then her voice gentle but firm. "When women stop competing and start standing beside each other, the world shifts on its axis." Victoria turned toward her, startled. "You must be Eleanor, the troublemaker who taught your sister to build her own table," Eleanor said with a half-smile. "You were never her enemy, dear. Fear was." Victoria nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I think I finally understand that." We moved to the seating area by the fireplace. The flames danced high, painting the room in gold and orange. For the first time in a long while, we sat facing each other, not as rivals, not as strangers, but as 2 women shaped by the same storm. "I used to resent you," Victoria admitted, "because you never stopped fighting him. I thought that made you reckless. Now I think it made you free." I stared into the fire. "I used to wish you'd fight with me, or at least not against me." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry." For years, those 2 words had lived somewhere between impossible and unthinkable. Hearing them now didn't erase anything, but it softened the edges of the past. I took a slow sip of wine. "It's not about me forgiving you. It's about what you do next." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Then I'll start by walking away from the company, from him, from all of it. Do it because it's right," I said, "not because you feel guilty." "I will." The room fell quiet again, except for the faint hum of the wind outside. Eleanor excused herself, giving us the privacy we didn't know we needed. For the first time since childhood, Victoria leaned back against the sofa, shoulders relaxed. She glanced at the photos on the mantel, Aurora's first scholarship recipient smiling in cap and gown. "You built something real, Lore. Something that matters. So did you," I said softly. "You built your life back even if it took time." She laughed through the tears. "I'm not sure I deserve that kind of credit yet." "Deserve doesn't matter," I said. "Choice does." We sat there for a while watching the fire shift colors, amber to crimson to gold. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt earned. Eventually she set her glass down and whispered, Do you think he'll ever forgive us? I looked at her. The flames reflected in her eyes. Maybe one day he'll realize there was nothing to forgive. We just stopped playing his game. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft against the windows. The fire crackled louder, and for the first time in years, my sister and I didn't look away from each other. No bitterness, no distance, just the quiet understanding that survival doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes it just means coming home. The morning light came late to the mountains, pale and hesitant, slipping through the glass like it wasn't sure it belonged there. Snowhaven was quiet. Too quiet. The storm from the night before had finally stopped, leaving the trees coated in a delicate shimmer that looked almost unreal. I woke to the soft vibration of my phone on the nightstand. At first, I ignored it, too comfortable under the blanket's weight. But the buzzing didn't stop. I reached for it, eyes still half closed, and froze when the screen lit up. 87 missed calls, every single one from the same name. Dad. For a moment, I just stared at it, the number almost absurd. 87 times he'd called. The last missed call was only 10 minutes ago. Then I saw the message. Just one line. I'm sorry. My hands went still. It wasn't the words themselves that stopped me. It was how strange they looked coming from him. My father had spent his entire life building walls out of pride and precision. Sorry was a word that didn't exist in his vocabulary. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone resting in my lap. The sun had started to melt the frost outside, sending rivulets of water down the window pane. It reminded me of tears that had taken too long to fall. I wrapped a scarf around my neck and stepped out onto the balcony. The cold bit at my skin, immediately sharp and clean. Below, the valley stretched out like a sheet of glass, the river glinting faintly between drifts of snow. The wind whipped my hair across my face, and for a second, I closed my eyes. There was no anger left in me, not even the quiet resentment I used to carry like armor. Just fatigue and something softer than forgiveness. Quieter than peace. Inside the fireplace, crackled faintly the only sound that reminded me I wasn't alone. Somewhere across the city, I knew he was sitting in his office, the same one that once smelled of cigars and power. Now it probably smelled of paper and dust. And just as I imagined in that very moment, Richard Hayes sat alone behind his desk, the blinds half drawn, the winter light cutting his face into shadows. His hair had gone gray faster these last few months, his shoulders smaller beneath his pressed suit. On the screen across from him, the morning news played on low volume. Federal investigators continue to review internal charity transfers from Hayes Development Group, the anchor was saying. CEO Richard Hayes has declined to comment. He reached for the remote, but didn't change the channel. The next segment rolled seamlessly into footage from the Aurora Gala. My voice carried through the speakers, calm and measured. Forgiveness isn't weakness, I said on the screen. It's the quiet strength to move forward, without carrying the weight of the past. The camera lingered on my face on the crowd behind me, standing to applaud. He stared at it for a long time, the edges of his vision blurring. He turned the volume down and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to respond, to argue, to reclaim the narrative. There was nothing left to defend. The papers on his desk were scattered, statements, audit requests, letters from lawyers, but he couldn't bring himself to read them anymore. Instead, he opened the drawer to his right and pulled out the old leather checkbook he hadn't used in years. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the pen. Then slowly he began to write, "Pay to the Order of Aurora Foundation. Amount $1,000. He paused again, staring at the words. There was no memo line, no note, just his signature. Richard Hayes. When he finished, he folded the check and placed it inside a plain white envelope. For a long time, he just sat there, his hands resting on it, his breathing uneven. The sunlight hit the edge of his desk, catching the silver in his hair, the tremor in his fingers. He looked up once more at the TV screen. My face was gone now, replaced by another story, another world. But he whispered into the quiet. You were right. Back at Snowhaven, I stood by the balcony railing, my phone still in my pocket. The wind had softened, and in the valley below, the snow reflected the morning light like shards of glass. By noon, I was back in my office at Aurora, reviewing applications for our spring grants. The front desk buzzed, and Sophie's voice came through the intercom. Lauren. There's something here for you. It just came by courier. Bring it in. I said, not looking up. She entered a moment later holding a thick envelope. No return address. Just your name. I took it, slid a letter opener through the seal, and pulled out a folded check. My breath caught. The number written across it shimmered faintly in the light. $1 million. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. I didn't say anything. Sophie watched me uncertain. "Do you want me to verify it?" I shook my head slowly. "No need." Eleanor appeared at the doorway, her face calm, knowing. "Who's it from?" I handed her the check. She looked at it once, then back at me. "You don't have to cash it," she said softly. "I know." She studied me for a moment. "How do you feel?" I looked down at the paper again, then folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. "Lighter," I said after a moment. Like a story finally ended the way it needed to. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You won without anyone having to lose." I met her gaze and nodded. "That's the only kind of winning that lasts." She stepped closer, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Keep that check somewhere safe, not for the money. For the meaning." As she left, I looked out the window. The sun had melted most of the ice on the glass, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly from the eaves. For years I had dreamed of hearing my father say those two words, "I'm sorry." I used to imagine what I'd say back, how it would feel to finally be seen. But now that the moment had come, I realized it wasn't about being seen. It was about being free. I set the envelope on my desk and smiled to myself. Outside, the snow kept melting slow and steady, revealing the earth beneath, clean, untouched, waiting for something new to grow. By February, the snow in Denver had begun to loosen its grip. The city no longer looked trapped in white, only softened by it. Aurora Foundation had been named Humanitarian Organization of the Year, and the invitation to speak at the awards ceremony arrived with a weight I hadn't expected. That night, as I stood backstage, the murmur of the audience filled the auditorium like a heartbeat. I could see flashes of light through the curtains, cameras, reporters, familiar faces. Some I recognized from the gala, others I hadn't seen in years. My sister sat in the second row beside Eleanor, both of them smiling when they caught my eye. When they called my name, I walked onto the stage beneath the bright lights. The applause rose around me, warm, alive. I wore a white suit this time, not a gown. It felt right, like closure. I took the microphone, waited for the noise to fade, and then began. I don't remember every success, I said, my voice steady, but I remember every time I was told I didn't belong. I remember standing outside a room, hearing laughter on the other side of the door. I remember sitting at the end of a table, waiting for someone to notice I was there. A hush swept across the room. But being left out, I continued, wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of it, because the moment I stopped asking for a seat, I realized I could build a table of my own. And the best part about building your own table, I paused, meeting their eyes, is that you get to choose who's welcome. There was silence for a beat, then applause. Not the polite kind, but the kind that carries meaning. Some stood. Others wiped tears. I saw Victoria rise first, clapping until the crowd followed. When the ceremony ended, the reporters swarmed near the exits, but I slipped out a side door with Eleanor and Sophie. The night air was crisp, the streets glittering with the last traces of melting snow. Eleanor looked at me, her voice soft. "You spoke like someone who's finally made peace." I smiled. I think I did. Across the city, in a house once defined by control, Richard Hayes sat in his study surrounded by silence. The television played the same ceremony I had just left, the sound turned low. My voice drifted through the speakers, calm and distant. "You get to choose who's welcome." He turned off the sound completely, leaving only the image. The reflection of me speaking, smiling alive, in a way he'd never understood. The light from the TV flickered across his lined face, catching the silver in his hair. After a long moment, he stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, streaking the glass with water. The city stretched before him, glimmering in the early spring night. He rested his hand against the window pane and whispered something no one heard. Maybe it was an apology, maybe it was goodbye. Back in the mountains, Snowhaven was alive again. The winter crowds had thinned, but the lodge still hummed with laughter. In the main hall, staff cleared away the last decorations from the holiday season, the scent of pine and citrus still clinging faintly to the air. I walked the quiet hallway alone, the wooden floors creaking softly beneath my boots. Through the glass doors of the ballroom, I could hear music playing, a local band rehearsing for the next community event. I stopped at the plaque mounted beside the entrance. The words carved into it glowed faintly in the light. For those who were once left out, My fingers brushed against the engraved letters. The metal felt cool and smooth, but the meaning beneath it was warm, alive. Eleanor's reflection appeared beside mine in the glass. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Lauren," she said softly. "Not just for yourself. For everyone who's ever been told no." I turned to her and smiled. "I know." We stood there together for a long moment, listening to the laughter spilling from the ballroom. Later, when everyone had gone, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The last patches of snow clung stubbornly to the railings, but the air already smelled like spring, earth pine, and something new. The sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, washing the mountains in gold. I closed my eyes, breathing it in. They once told me I wasn't good enough to sit at their table. For years I believed them. I built my life around trying to earn a seat to prove my worth in rooms that were never meant for me. But now, I don't need their table. I built my own, and I left the door open for anyone who needs a place to belong. Inside, the lights of Snowhaven flickered on one by one, spilling warmth into the twilight. The laughter from inside grew louder, familiar, and real. I leaned against the railing, the snow melting quietly beneath my hands, and let the sound carry through the valley. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes the moment you stop waiting for an invitation and decide to build your own beginning. Thank you for listening. If this story reached you, stay with us for the next one. There's always another table to build.